Why is it that most literature reviews put everyone to sleep, while others seem to somehow pull us in as though we're watching a superhero action movie? And why is it that those literature reviews keep on receiving citation after citation, while most others are ignored or forgotten? Well, in my own experience working with graduate students, I have discovered some patterns that academic writers use to write and publish successful literature reviews. And in today's video, I'm going to reveal those patterns to you and show you how you can use them to write a literature review that'll leave your editors and readers saying, "Avengers, assemble!"
I understood that reference.
If you're new here, my name's William, and I'm an English professor working with some of the brightest scientists and engineers in South Korea. And this first tip about literature reviews is something that I discovered when I was doing my undergraduate degree, not in science and engineering, but in English literature. Now, a lot of people used to tease me by saying that studying English literature would have no real world benefit, and they were absolutely right. But this first tip has actually proven quite useful when it comes to writing literature reviews. And I think the easiest way to make this point would be to take a look at the literary masterpiece, The Avengers. The basic plot of the story is that at the start, Loki steals the Tesseract and threatens Earth, which leads Nick Fury to activate the Avengers Initiative. The Avengers meet, clash, and then come together to fight against Loki and his alien army in a massive battle in New York City. At the end of the film, spoiler alert, the Avengers defeat Loki and go their separate ways. That is what we in the English literature biz call the plot of the film. It's the series of events that you see on the screen when you're sitting there watching the movie. But what many people don't realize is that there's actually another layer of the film that we don't see because it's not always shown on screen. This layer includes not only the events of the film itself, but also all the characters' backstories and motivations. For example, it includes how the Avengers became who they are, like how Tony Stark became Iron Man, or how Steve Rogers transformed into Captain America. Loki's histories and motivations. What's this guy's problem anyway? And the actions of S.H.I.E.L.D. leading up to the formation of the Avengers. This second layer is called the story. It's bigger than the plot. It includes the broader narrative that the plot is a part of. It includes all the parts that might be hinted at or suggested, but that you don't see directly on screen. So to recap, the events that you see on the screen are called the plot, and everything in the background that deepens and enriches that plot is called the story. But what does this have to do with literature reviews? I'm glad you asked. The place where so many academic writers go wrong in the literature review is that they just list all the research that's been done before, and that makes the reader feel as though they're reading through a phone book. In other words, they forget that the literature review is supposed to tell a story. Now, to be fair, many of these academic writers will organize this research according to certain criteria, like when it was published, or the country the research was conducted in, or the field or the discipline, etc. They'll organize it under these headings, but organization is not a story, it's just the plot. It doesn't pull the reader in because it's just information. As a quick meta example, we're getting a little bit Inception-y in here. Why did we take this time to talk about the Avengers? Why didn't I just sit here and say, here are 3 things that you should do in your literature review? You get it? People like a story. It's what pulls us in and makes us open and receptive to the information. So here are some things that you can do to make sure that your literature review goes beyond the plot and tells a story. First, you really want to cast your literature review carefully. Just like in the Avengers, there are main characters such as Captain America and Thor. Well, similarly, in your literature review, there are going to be primary studies. These are the key sources, the studies that are most relevant and impactful for your research topic. They're the ones that drive the plot of your literature review. So you want to select them carefully and really bring out their key insights and findings. Now, of course, in all good stories, alongside these major characters are minor characters like Hawkeye or Black Widow. Now, their role is important, but it's not central. It's kind of supporting the main roles of the primary characters. These supporting characters are not the focus of the story, and you would probably never see them in a scene of their own, but when they do appear in a scene alongside one of the main characters, they help to bring out some aspect of that character's personality or struggle through comparison and contrast. Well, similarly, you want to think, what are the minor studies and how can I position them alongside the major studies in order to bring out some deeper meaning through comparison and contrast? These minor studies should not really appear in paragraphs of their own. They probably won't receive integral citations. They'll be less dominant in the way that you write about them, but their positioning can really help to bring out some of the major findings in your primary sources. So as you're sorting through all the studies in your literature review, you can think about which of these would be considered allies to the primary characters in your literature review. That is, which ones share similar methodologies or similar findings, and conversely, which ones would be considered adversaries, those which contradict or complicate the major characters in your literature review. Finally, a good movie is never going to have a character that doesn't contribute in some way to the story. So you should leave out sources that don't contribute meaningfully to the story that you're telling. You need to be quite selective in the characters that you let in to your literature review. Everybody in there should be important and contributing in some way to the single story that you're trying to tell in this literature review. Now, I'll admit, writing an academic literature review is probably not going to be quite as thrilling as writing a Marvel superhero movie, but you do not need to be a Hollywood writer in order to bring this research to life. All you need is to be able to see the forest through the trees. The trees are the plot. It's all the research that has been conducted on your topic. And our goal here is to reveal a pattern in all of these studies that makes our research look like the missing piece of the puzzle. Now, normally what academic writers will do when they're gathering all this research is to organize it into a grid using either a spreadsheet or academic software like Zotero. And while I'm a big fan of having a method of organizing all your files, I really don't think that it's a good first step when you are developing your literature review. Because take a look at this. Here's all the research that I gathered on the Tesseract. It's an exciting field of research, and I've organized it into a matrix according to certain criteria, such as when it was published, or the country in which the research was conducted, or the field of research, or its findings. And that makes good sense, but the problem that I see in organizing a literature review into a grid like this is that it imposes a grid on our thinking. And we don't naturally think this way. Our mind is not organized into a grid. This has been called the linear straitjacket. And this linear thinking is what I think causes so many writers to miss the forest and get lost in the trees. Now, in just a moment, I'm going to show you how you can really bring out that forest using certain storytelling techniques. But first, what I really want to make clear here is the reason why we're spending so much attention in bringing out this story. And it's because we can never demonstrate the value of our research if the story that we tell about it is first this happened, then this study happened, then he published this, and now I did this report. That's not valuable. That's just information. So instead of this grid, I recommend using a mind map technique in which you write your research topic in the middle, and then you think of just certain hooks, the big topics that come to mind when you, the writer, think about that topic. Then you can start to rearrange all this research to think, where does it fit? And that will reveal the major and minor characters in your story, and it'll also give you a really good way of positioning your research next to it all. But now what I really want to get into is some technique that you can use in telling your literature review story, because the way that you tell this story is just as important as the story itself. So we have to come back to our purpose. Why are we telling this literature review story? We want to persuade the reader. Specifically, we want to persuade the reader that our research is a meaningful and important contribution to the field. We want them to like us and then accept our research and say, hey, this is good stuff. And persuasion is not just a matter of telling a story. It also involves selecting the right words so that you can engage with that literature and with the reader in ways that are socially appropriate. Take a look at these two movie reviews for The Avengers. One is from the Wall Street Journal and the other is from the New Yorker. There's a really big and important difference in the way that the authors are using personal pronouns. So let me read them to you and see if you can catch it. In the Wall Street Journal, the author says, "I'll explain the asterisk later." The asterisk, in case you don't know, is that little star symbol, and it appears in one sentence before. So I'll explain the asterisk later. First, let me note the magnitude of the event for the movie's fan base versus the oddity of the mashup. A slow start, a single star performance surrounded by indifferent acting, and an onslaught of computer effects that range from Seen It All and Transformers to a whole sky full of spectacular stuff in the Midtown Manhattan climax. That's the Wall Street Journal, but compare that with this short passage from the article in the New Yorker. I couldn't understand a word until he asked, quote, "The humans, what can they do but burn?" If he is referring to our cooking skills, this is grossly unfair, for we can also poach, broil, gently simmer, and steam en papillote. Now, there are a few things that we could say about those movie reviews, but again, the one that I want to draw your attention to is the way these authors are using personal pronouns like I, me, and you. I think there is a really big difference between saying, "I'll explain this later," and saying, "I couldn't understand a word he was saying." Now, in that first case, when the writer in the Wall Street Journal says, "I'll explain this later," that personal pronoun I is pointing inside the text to what Eric Hyatt calls the author function of the paper. I mean, it's not like the author is going to meet you for lunch later and explain this to you. It's an I that only exists inside the text. It's like saying I think or I argue. The personal pronoun I represents an author that exists only inside the text. But that second case, when the New Yorker tells us about what it was like to sit there and watch the movie and not understand what the characters were saying, that points outside the text to a real flesh and blood author, a character that has just entered the representational space of the text. And by introducing this new character into the text, the author creates that second layer that we were talking about earlier. In the Wall Street Journal, there's just this flat one layer. It's a movie review. But in the New Yorker piece, by introducing this flesh and blood author, the one who went to go see the movie and was sitting there and couldn't understand what the characters were saying, that character introduces this second layer. So we have the plot, which is the movie review, and the story, which is the underlying narrative of how that author got up one day and went to the movies and watched a movie. And the New Yorker piece really does a great job at bringing out this story level. We see a lot of the author in the narrative, not only through the use of personal pronouns, but also through his references to pop culture and funny side comments. All that personality really helps to develop the character in the story, and now we as the reader are watching a story, and we are a lot more willing to accept the writer's opinions and criticisms of the movie if we can identify with the character in that story. It's the story that allows the writer to make a much more personal connection with the reader, and when the reader has a personal connection to the writer, they're a lot more persuadable. They're a lot more willing to follow the reader through all the details of the research and to be persuaded by the writer's conclusions and ideas. Now, I know that a common piece of writing advice that gets thrown around in academic writing circles is to not use the personal pronoun I. And you can do that if you want to. It's going to tell a different kind of story. The story that it'll tell is one of a researcher who's small and in the background and wants to put the spotlight onto the research itself. It doesn't make for a very compelling story, but you might want to do that in cases where you're talking about your own research and you don't want to come across as arrogant or too self-congratulating. Well, you can take yourself out of the equation and just talk about the research as though it exists on its own. Or if you were dealing with a controversial research topic, you might not want to name people directly. You might just want to talk about these beliefs as though they exist on their own. In those cases, it's understandable to avoid using personal pronouns. But this second use of personal pronouns that we see in the New Yorker article creates a much more engaging, multi-dimensional story with a persona that the reader can really get to like and trust. And when the reader likes and trusts you, they're going to be a lot more persuadable. And that's our goal here. We want to persuade the reader that our research is meaningful and important. Now, all right, real talk. There is a widespread misconception, come here, that academic writing should be formal and impersonal. And I think that's why so many writers have difficulty getting published and receiving citations, because research shows that articles which are written in an informal tone and from a more personal voice receive the most citations and get published in the highest impact journals. So to learn how you can use this research to write articles that receive more citations and get published in better journals, you need to check out this video right here, because it's going to show you how to use personal pronouns and 2 other language items to receive more citations and get more publications. So be sure to go check it out.